Welcome to the podcast, Akram. We're really, really excited to have you here tonight in this beautiful room, the OSC reading room. And tonight, as you know, we're going to be talking all about interdisciplinary teaching and learning. And so, first question. You've explored numerous domains of learning both as a student and a teacher. Can you share with us some of the key learning experiences and decisions you've made along the way in your educational journey?
Right. Well, I was born in Afghanistan, right in the middle of a civil war, but we came from a very good family, a very well-known family, a family with connections and with resources at their disposal. And I suppose if there had been no war, then I would have very likely have moved into the upper crust of Afghan society, had a nice cushy job for myself, and life would have been quite easy for me, right? But then the war took everything from us, and we had to flee, and we had to go to Pakistan. And what I remember about Pakistan and the schooling there is because I was so young, I was able to pick up the language really quickly. And
what age were you when you moved to Pakistan?
I was about... part of this is the story is not fully mine, right? So what I'm going to say is just out of respect for other people, right? Because this story is quite a sensitive story, and a lot of tragedy surrounds it. And I don't want to speak in a way that may give other people's story up in a way. Okay. So if I had more people with me here right now, I'd give you more details with their respect. But all I can say is very, very young. And I was able to pick up the language really quickly. And what that allowed me to do is sort of be a bridge between the Afghan kids and the Pakistani kids, all right? And it did two things that were really significant. I didn't realize at the time. Firstly, it put me at the center of attention, and I was okay with that, being a conduit from these two different domains, right? From the Pakistani kids to the Afghan kids and socially managing those relationships. It also gave me power for the first time in my life because I'd actually absorbed a whole bunch of prejudices from my own community. And I remembered very distinctly doing a few things that I would now consider very racist, right? I said and I did some very racist things. I excluded kids based on what they looked like. I was practicing out a lot of cultural narratives. And this was a very young kid. And here's the thing. When I was excluding those kids, I enjoyed it. That's the really dark side about it, is that what makes you feel like you belong more than anything else is being able to exclude someone else. Wow, that power, that rush, right? You don't belong. Oh, being able to say that to someone. What greater affirmation of your own belonging than being able to kick someone out, having that kind of power over the group. I do remember that. And I also remember that I was put at the top of the class. So they would refer to me as number one. And I remember the status that went along with that, right? That education, right, could be weaponized socially, right? Where it could translate within the system into areas of immense power. And by virtue of that educational position, it also gave me a lot of social power. So if it wasn't for us coming into Australia, my life again may have looked very different. But when I was about 10, we won the golden ticket. Just a bit like the Willy Wonka story, right? That's exactly how a visa to Australia looked to us. And in theory and statistics, that's exactly what it was. It was like we're winning a golden ticket from the Willy Wonka factory. And we came to Australia. And suddenly I went from the very top of the class to not speaking the language, not understanding the culture, and suddenly being at the very bottom. I remember very distinctly I failed an English test. And I didn't just fail an English test. I just completely... It was so bad. It was so bad. And this was still the days where people gave Fs, right? I'm aging myself, right? Where if you failed something, you would get an F with a red letter, right? With a red pen. And one of the other kids, he put up my paper to the other kids and he said, "Look, Akram has failed," right? And the spelling was so bad. I had no idea what I was doing. And the other kids laughed. And suddenly I became the object of ridicule. I was told I was stupid. And you know what? I believed it.
And that was coming from number one.
Yeah, to being stupid. It just shows you how flexible these categories are. Here I am one day at the very top of my age group's academic power hierarchy. And then the next day I'm at the very bottom, right? And things look very different from the bottom than they do from the top. In fact, I would say the world looks nothing alike. And in that position, at first I try to resist. But when you're told you're stupid often enough and you're ridiculed for it, at first you resist. And then you realize it's easier to co-opt that. So I did. I took that badge of stupidity and I slammed it into my chest and wore it like a badge of pride. I'm stupid. And as you can imagine, kids who think they're stupid are going to do stupid things because that becomes their armor. That becomes the only way. It's about owning it. So then no one can give you a hard time for it because I was the one who said it first. And so my life looked very bleak at that point, right?
There's a lot of experience in a very short amount of time, experience in different cultures, experience of different levels of hierarchy within those micro cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got also exposed to racism for the first time, being at the other end of the equation. And suddenly I didn't like it very much. It's not fun because being excluded hurts in a way that can only make sense in light of our evolutionary history. See, for our primate brains, there are few things as scary as being excluded, because being excluded means you no longer have the protection of the tribe. It means you're going to die, right? For us, exclusion is not just a bad feeling. Oh, it hurts a little bit. It is a signal that death is about to come and take us. That's why our ancestors had such a big fear of being excluded, because exclusion literally means death, not just bad feelings. And the part of the brain that actually deals with physical pain is also the same part that deals with exclusionary pain. So as far as the brain is concerned, being smacked by a baseball bat and being disrespected and being removed from a group is about the same thing. It hurts about the same, right? Except one shows wounds and you can address it, the other one's all internal. So that was the first time I really experienced racism, at the other end of the equation, at the pointy end of it. And it was going to be bad. I knew it was going to be bad, but then I had no idea what was going to come. September 11, 2001. Suddenly, I thought I had it bad before. It was nothing compared to what happened after September 11. Suddenly, I went from being just inferior, because there is a racism towards inferior things. So long as inferior things know their place, they're actually okay, right? It's only when inferior things don't know their place that we have to put them back in their place. Suddenly, I went from being inferior to being dangerous, to being polluting.
To being the enemy.
Being the enemy. And I have to give so much credit to those kids at my school, because here they were, right? This existential event had happened, and the faces on their TV screens for days and days and days was these brown men. The only creature that looked like those brown men on the screen was me. And we all have an innate sense of justice, right? This idea that if somebody harms someone, we have to do retribution. We have to even out the scales of justice. And so a new class of bullies emerged. And these bullies were not about making you feel worse about yourself because they had low self-esteem, or like, no, these are the class of bullies that are called the virtuous bullies. And they did it out of a sense of justice. We can't get those men that had done this terrible thing in September 11, but Akram, you're the closest proxy to that. If we punish you enough, maybe, just maybe, the scales of justice will be evened out. And the idea of collective punishment is very common to our species. Right? The idea of innocence until proven guilty, individuated guilt, these are very new concepts, right? Much deeper concepts are collective responsibility. If you hurt me, I hurt your family, close enough. We're very okay with that, right? And these kids would do all sorts of things to me, physical violence, lots of verbal abuse, pouring cans of Coke in my bag, right? So the ants would come and I'd be devastated because the girls would then see me with this soggy bag with ants on it, right? Even then, my little brain was like, I don't mind the boys looking at me with ridicule. Honestly, their opinion doesn't really matter. But the girls, their opinion really does matter. I don't know why, but I should not be feeling this way, right? And of course, my parents can't do anything because they know less about this culture than I do. And suddenly the roles at home are reversed. I am the one who has to become their parents. When we go to the shops, I have to navigate the cultural space. Suddenly the parent becomes the child and the child becomes the parent because I have access to more cultural knowledge. So can you imagine the anger building up there, right? The resentment that I have to be this reservoir of all this resentment, all this anger, and my identity becoming a source of pollution. Because that's what those kids were doing, those virtuous bullies were doing. They were trying to beat the pollution out of me, the moral pollution. If they just beat me enough, just maybe, the world would become a more just place, right? This is called negative reciprocity, right? You hurt me a little bit, I'm going to hurt you more, right? And Akram, someone who looked like you did this terrible thing, and now we're going to hurt you for it. And that makes perfect emotional sense.
So how did that affect your motivation for, for education and for being successful? Do you think it consciously had an impact on you?
This is where the pivot happens. That story is really important to know because at this stage, I hope everyone can see, education was a boon to me, right? It was just very, very good to me. I'd used it in ways that were really unhealthy, although I didn't realize it at that time, being at the very top of the educational pyramid, and now finding myself at the very bottom. I hated education system. It was a trap. Going to school was I dreaded every day. I would have dreams and nightmares, right, whereby I would imagine I'd wake up and somehow my skin had turned white. And then I could go to school. Right, man, if I had whiteness as a defense, that would have been so good. But I didn't. And I also was very small. I wouldn't hit puberty until I was at university. So, puberty would come a long way. Muscle development would come a long way. The ability to physically defend myself would come a very long way. So I had no physical way of fighting back. I had no way of changing the cultural narrative around me. I hated the idea of education now, right? Because it was a trap. I was confined with people who were hurting me. What does a kid do in that sort of circumstances when he can't run and when he can't fight? The third option is to play dead, to go numb. And that's what I did. I became really, really numb. And probably year 8, year 9, and year 10, I was just absolutely numb on the inside. Because that was the best way to defend myself. To put the self in this tiny little box and just put it in a dark corner somewhere and let all the stimuli just wash over me, essentially as a minor dissociative state. And it was in this particular moment that an amazing teacher steps into my life. His name is Mr. Andrew Bell. He's still teaching. He's an extraordinary teacher. And every day Mr. Bell would come to me, and every day he would say something like, "Akram, how are you?" And every day I'd be like, I'm very, very, very angry. Part of the reason why I didn't want anyone around me is now I realize it was out of protection. Because if I had such a low status, if I was a source of moral pollution, right, why would I want to infect others? I didn't want to bring down Mr. Bell with me, right? Of course, I couldn't rationalize that. I couldn't articulate that. But pushing away people at that age was, now I realize, a very rational response. Imagine if I had been radioactively infected or I had radioactive material in my body. The most honorable thing I can do is isolate myself from everyone else. Why would I want to go near someone and hurt them as well? That's how I thought of myself and my identity at that moment. But every day Mr. Bell would come and say, "Hello, how are you, Akram?" And every day I'd do that angry thing. And then eventually he broke through those walls that I'd built around myself made out of fear and pain, and he chip at those little walls, and eventually he cracked through. And he cracked through by giving me little acts of dignity, little acts of respect. But more profoundly, what he was doing every day, he was reminding me there is somebody here, right, in whose life you belong. See, we don't belong in places. We think we belong in places. We use places as a shorthand for the people in those places. And what those people do is they say to you, "In my life, there's a little bit of space that I've carved out just for you." That's what it truly means to belong. We belong in each other's lives, not in places. Places just happen to be symbolic reminders that somebody said to us once, implicitly or explicitly, "Here is my life, and here's a little carve out for you." That's what Mr. Bell was doing. And that was really the first time I think a white person had said that to me, implicitly. And if it had been for him, can you see, I could have easily become very racist, because I would have thought, if every white person is horrible, right? You extrapolate from that. Notice the sample size always has to be really small. With racism, sample size has to be really small, right? And then you go, wait a second, but Mr. Bell also has pale skin. Why is he not a bad person, right? Maybe it has nothing to do with skin color, right? And so you look for other factors. You get a more sophisticated understanding of the world. And Mr. Bell said to me, "Akram, why don't you come to the library? I want to share some stories with you." This is, I think, the first time that I think I'd met a truly great teacher, because what he was able to discern what talents lay within me and what would it take to excite me. What would it take to ignite that spark of imagination, of interest, of intrigue, of passion, of interest for learning. And he realized it was stories. I can get this kid through stories. So he said he brought me to the library and he told me the story of Napoleon. He told me the story of Rasputin from the Russian history, right? And he used historical stories as a way of furnishing my mind with these very rich, detailed stories. He was teaching me history, but I realize now what he was really doing is, on what level, he was teaching me how to articulate myself. So I've always said this. What I'm doing right now to my podcast listeners, to all of you guys who are listening, and to you guys here in this room, I'm able to share something of my inner life because of what Mr. Bell taught me. It wasn't just the language. It was that openness of being able to share something with someone else and being okay with that. He was modeling that for me. And at a very deep level, I actually think he was modeling what it means to be a man for me. Because I was looking around and young boys, they're really asking this question: how do I be a man? I have testosterone. I don't know what to do with this testosterone. Please tell me, what does it mean to be a man, right? And healthy models of masculinity are very nurturing models of masculinity that are not about domination, right? That are about nurturing. And we did that for a few months. So he was building up my vocabulary. He was furnishing me with all this knowledge. And then he says, Akram, why don't you go and share this with the other kids? What? I don't understand, Mr. Bell. He said, go and share it with enthusiasm with the other kids. See what they think. So in the history class, I start helping out others, right? I start teaching them essentially what Mr. Bell had taught them, and in the way that Mr. Bell had taught them. Not in this condescending way. Not that I know better than you, but hey, I've got something really cool I want to share with you. And of course, by sharing history, what you're really doing is you're sharing part of yourself. You're sharing your time. You're sharing your attention, right? Never underestimate the power of sharing your attention with somebody. And very slowly, I started realizing something's changing around me. I was changing. I was starting to discover self-worth, this thing that I hadn't experienced for a very long time. And I realized why that was happening. Our self-worth comes from, not from what we've been given, but what we can give to those around us, right? Value is the importance of our actions being reflected to us in the eyes of others. And for the first time, I had my actions being reflected to me as important, good actions. And I could take that and start putting that into my notion of the self. So self-esteem comes from community esteem, not the other way around. And the kids that I was interacting with, I started noticing they're changing as well. They were starting to become far friendlier, far more open to me. And you have to give them credit. They were really struggling with September 11 and its consequences. And here is somebody who has a similar face to the men who did this terrible thing.
How much of that acceptance do you think is a result of you understanding the culture further, or is it a result of something else?
Part of it is me understanding them, absolutely. Part of them is them slowly opening themselves up to understanding me, right? Basically, this was a campaign of humanization, right? To the point where I always remember this. I've said this story many times, but I was in the library and there was a group of kids who were talking, and what they had done is, because they were grappling with this profound trauma and they were kids and they didn't know how to reason, they didn't have the adult capabilities, right? So for them, this was a cataclysmic event and they were trying to make sense of it symbolically. And I heard them talking and they said, oh, Akram's not one of them, Akram's Akram. And I realize now what they'd done. They basically had category of Australians, horrible people, right? And Akram. So I was made into my own category of people, a singular category of one. And that's how they were able to reconcile the terrible events that were happening in the world and the fact that they had somebody who had a face that looked like those men that had done this terrible thing. And slowly the school culture started changing around me. I started finding myself opening up to them, and then I started had folks opening to up. And the more I learned, the more I realized I could help my fellow classmates. And every time I helped someone, it not only made me feel good, it felt like the relationship was growing. It was a gift. I was giving them a gift, right? And slowly I was trying to find, they were giving me gifts back by their recognition, by their acknowledgement.
Can I ask, did you have to be on the front foot with your own vulnerability with them
totally.
For that to happen?
Totally. I think I became a teacher out of survival, out of necessity, right? I've never stopped teaching. There has never been a semester of my life since 2004, 2005 that I have not taught a unit, either at university or at a school, right? There's never been, I don't think I've gone more than 2 months, the school holidays, without teaching, right? And it was in that particular crucible that this skill emerged. And I think Mr. Bell knew that I had this capacity, that this passion for teaching. And he enabled me to do it myself. And not only did he give me something, but he gave me a way of giving back to my school. And those very kids who, a few years ago had probably been very scared of me and had struggled to conceptualize how I could possibly belong in their lives, they picked me as the head boy. I was the head boy of the school.
Wow.
That tells you something really fascinating, not about me. That's the bit that I need to really emphasize. This is not about an individual. This is more about the story of how fluid culture really is, how fluid culture in a school really is, right? The kids make the school culture that they live in, right? And there's a moment of realization, all of them, oh my God, I'm the one who makes this culture. Why can't I make it a little bit better? Why does it have to be horrible? Why does it have to be full of nastiness, hate, exclusion? And I think that particular cohort chose a more compassionate culture for our school. And it was an amazing experience to be their head boy. And I was acutely aware of the privilege that they were giving me. Right? I was acutely aware that they were saying something really important about themselves by having someone who looked like me up on that stage. Right? And in that year, I did basically what Mr. Bell had taught me. I tried to teach others what I'd been taught myself. Then, because of that, not because of studying itself, but because I wanted to share my knowledge with others, my grades started going up. I went from failing to being the top student at the end of in the ATAR, or the TE in those days, ATAR for nowadays, right? And I didn't get those grades because I sought out those grades. I got those grades as a lovely byproduct because I wanted to learn so I could help my fellow classmates, right? Because every time I helped them, a new relationship would form, right? I could give them something. I finally had something good to give to another human being, right? And with my grades, I was able to get into university, and my English really, really sucked at that stage. So I chose something that didn't require essay writing. I did anatomy, new, and biology to buy myself time. And anatomy, new, and biology, it's basically putting a lot of information in your brain, right, and then regurgitating it. And I really liked that because that could buy me a bit of time from essay writing. And I worked on a little bit on my English in the next 2 years. But I met this amazing chap who could think about the world in a really interesting way. He could take ideas, chop them down, and then reconstitute them in a new way that would fit his purposes. And I thought that's a really neat trick, right? Being able to do analysis and then synthesis of what he had analyzed. Because analyze means just to chop up into constituent parts, because no idea is really complicated. It's only complicated because ideas are amalgams of smaller ideas, right? If you strip something down to its most essential components, it's actually pretty straightforward. A bit like a molecule, right? A molecule is quite complicated, but when you break it down into its atomic form, right, it's not necessarily that complicated. Ideas are a bit like that. It's a decomposition process, right? So you decompose it and then you recompose it in light of your purposes. And I could see him doing that, and I was like, wow, that's so cool. It almost looks like a superpower. And he said, I can do this because I was taught this in law. And he helped me get into law by putting in the late fee, because I didn't want to do it. So he took me to the admin office, and he put the $200 late fee. Right? Quite a remarkable story when you think about someone being this kind to you. And he got me into law, and I started law. And the first 2 years of law were brutal, because not only did I have to learn the law, I had to learn how to articulate myself at that level of academic expression, right? So I had to consciously teach myself, what is a good essay? What is a good argument?
Can we ask just about the language? So you've obviously come from a different language initially. You went through how many before? 2 languages before coming to Australia and speaking English. You might have learned a little bit of English back in Afghanistan. And you've got a good vocabulary now. Has having had multiple languages helped with your language acquisition?
I think so. I've changed what language I dream in. So I used to dream in Farsi, then Urdu, and now English. Right, so everybody in my head plays Urdu. Speaks in English, but sometimes some of the subtitles are in Urdu or in Farsi.
And with the change, I think language is sometimes described as it's being an operating system for a culture almost.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is.
Do you think differently?
I do.
In
I
different
find
languages?
with Farsi, there's a couple of reasons for it. My Urdu is it's almost completely gone because I've had no practice in it. But because I speak Farsi with my mum, but that Farsi is trapped almost at a 10-year-old's Farsi, right? So I'm noticing my intellectual world in Farsi is limited to the intellectual world of a 10-year-old.
But I notice when you tell stories, you actually go back to an accent too, which is interesting.
It happens naturally because I'm almost recreating that past moment, right? Or that past memory is recreating itself in the present. It's reconstituting itself in the present moment. And with English, I find I'm far more brash, far more argumentative in a way that I would never be with Farsi.
Because the culture of English is more open to those
more individualistic, and that actually is expressed in the language itself. Whereas in Farsi, it is far more respectful. There's far more rituals in discourse that you have to adhere to. Rituals of, for example, who gets to come into the room. When we leave, you have to, you have to tell me 5 times to stay, right? There's a lot of rituals, right, around politeness, right? Not necessarily warmth. I do have to say that. There's a lot of rituals around politeness, but they're not always necessarily warm, right? And sometimes in Afghan culture, you can really see the tension between the two. People are super polite, but not very warm, right? So sometimes there's a part of me that appreciates the Australian openness where they tell you they don't like you. They don't even bother trying, right? And to an Afghan, we're like, please be subtle with how you show someone how you don't like them. There's a greater degree of sophistication in being critical of others in Farsi than there is in English, right? It's more indirect. You can say a lot worse things about people, right? But because you're doing it indirectly, we think it's better. But I honestly prefer the more honest approach. Yeah.
And is there any changes in your thought pattern with writing? Because writing would be a whole other
It is.
concept.
And I basically had to break language down into its constituent parts, particularly the English language, and what does academic language require of you, right? So academic language puts a premium on clarity. That doesn't like finesse, it doesn't like really evocative language. No. It likes super blunt, super
and
dense.
for someone who likes stories, that must have been horrible for you.
It was very difficult,
Yeah.
and I had to learn how to write in an academic way. And the first few times that I did, I failed miserably, but I kept at it, and eventually I got the hang of it. And I got the hang of it not intuitively like most of my fellow classmates, but because I'd broken down
You could analyse.
each constituent parts. So I know how to break down a topic sentence, right? Like no one else. Even in a sentence itself, like what is the engine of a sentence? For me, the engine of a sentence is the verb, right? And the driver is the character, right? And they may or may not go somewhere because all you need is the character and the verb, right? But what exactly is a verb? The verb is the ontological ground of any sentence, right? It just shows that something exists. Right? Is probably a sentence, right? Something is, right? It's something exists. Now you can add something more to that existence. You can add an action to that existence, right? And so we have something moved, right? That's a basic level, right? That's all our brain requires, a cause and an effect. So for me to learn language, I kind of had to go into theory of mind, right? So our brain is very good at picking up patterns of cause and effect, even when they're not there, right? But that's what we think with. That I think is once you understand some of the operating grammar or operating software that we came with, kind of like the, what do they call it when the Mac or Windows software that comes from the plant. When they make it, they just
beta software.
Not so much the beta software, more like the what's the word I'm looking for? The software that comes into the not native software, the default software or the factory software, the factory model software, right? This is about unpacking that. Unpacking, for example, a deductive reasoning approach versus an inductive reasoning approach versus an abductive reasoning approach. I had to learn these things in a conscious way where I was very jealous of my fellow classmates who could do this, envious of my fellow classmates who could intuitively do this. They had a practice, but they had no theory to explain their practice.
Well, they have a limited practice, and you've got multiple operating systems.
That's right, which gives you a massive advantage, I realize now.
Which is really what we're talking about here,
being able
right?
to step out from a particular perspective and put on a different perspective and come at the same problem, suddenly the problem changes, or the nature, the way it looks changes.
Can I ask, Akram, do you think that multiple operating systems in the sense of the language then gave you a bit of this secret sauce to then when you went on to explore all these disciplines that you've explored as that kind of, well, almost like a secret weapon that has allowed you to more readily go into, anatomy, human biology, then law, then sociology? Yeah.
I think so to a large extent, yes. It has helped me reflect on how it is that they communicate the content that they communicate, right? What sort of packaging does this mode of knowledge come in, right? And being able, and this is very difficult, it's not always even possible, being able to discern the packaging from the contents of those packaging, right? And not getting bogged down in the packaging and being able to go to the content. And sometimes that's not easy, right? Often that's not easy. Once you get more and more deeper into it, you can't really get into it anymore. But what it did allow me to do is be able to reflect on any area of knowledge using another area of knowledge and realize the limitations, right? Because no area of knowledge is able to turn back on itself and say, I have these limitations. It is only when you see that area of knowledge from another perspective do you realize its limitations. It's a bit like, to be honest with you, it's a bit like the eyeball. I always have the analogy of the eyeball. The eyeball can see everything out from itself, but it can never look back into itself, right? In some ways, that's kind of like the mind as well. It really struggles. If all we have is one operating software, right, then it's very hard to think about something you think with. That's precisely why you need something else to think about the thing that you were previously thinking with, right? It is only transcontextually can you understand your original mode of thinking. And
it's probably good. You could probably say from that it's logical to conclude that a broader experience improves that ability.
It does. And that's where once I had the scientific knowledge and that scientific training from human biology and anatomy and started teaching that, then combined that with law, suddenly I realized, wow, we can approach knowledge from completely different perspectives. We can have completely different ontological presuppositions.
So can I ask, so when you went into law and you finished that law degree, how did you then, transfer that skill set into understanding anatomy and biology? Were there thinking approaches, strategies and models that apply in law that you could then turn back into the natural sciences and vice versa?
And one of the critical insights transcontextually that happened is that we do knowledge production and consensus as to what counts as knowledge far more like the law model or the social sciences model than the physical sciences model. The physical sciences would like to think, right, that they have the answer. There's a positivist approach, the idea that you can actually know something, right, and the world corresponds to this particular knowledge, right? And the fact that when we do a hypothesis and then we see results, data come in, empirical data come in, we can generate a theory that completely explains that, right? There's a certain robustness to it. Whereas with the social sciences, we're always like, oh, there's so many other factors we didn't take into account. The fact that the instrument that produced that knowledge was a human being, and this human being came from this particular background, and this would have shaped their understanding of this particular knowledge. And we qualify our knowledge so much that our conclusions have to be so much more tentative. If you really think about it, the physical sciences deals with the same problems, right? Yes, I'm looking down a microscope, but it's still a human eyeball that has to look down. Okay, you get rid of the human eyeball and you code for the visual spectrum. Okay, now some human being has to interpret that code. You can never get rid of interpretation. So that's the one great insight from the social sciences that you put into the physical sciences. The next one is the data that you generate. Well, yeah, the data you generated, but what's all the presuppositions that hold this data as data? Because when I approach a social science problem, right, I know there's so many more assumptions I need to make. So every time, for example, I'm doing my PhD on wealth, I have to make assumptions about what counts as a person, right? What counts as an asset? What counts as a relationship, right? I have to make these big assumptions in order to be able to study my topic. You know what? That's kind of what physical science is about. There's so many ontological and epistemological assumptions you have to make even before you generate a hypothesis, right? What it does, it doesn't mean that physical science is wrong. Rather, it means that just about every theory, every claim that we can make is limited. Our confidence has to be something less than 100%. And it may be 99.9%, and that's okay, right? Epistemologically, if those are our confidence levels, I'm totally okay with it. But we can never have 100% knowledge, right? That's what I realized, that we do science like the way the social scientists do science, not the way the physical scientists sometimes claim that they do science, right? I wish we did it. I wish we had super minds that could do physical science in a positive sense, but we don't have that. And the problem is when we claim we do physical sciences in a way where we truly know reality 100%, we can be 100% confidence in it, those are just claims through authority, right? That's no longer doing really good scientific reasoning. It is, I have perfect knowledge of reality, right? It flows from the author, and you'll find that it's inextricably bound with the identity of the person who's producing that paper, right? So whenever you get into the positive world, you'll find there's claims to authority built into it, baked into it, even if that's not explicit.
But what do you say to the, to challenge that somewhat? What do you say to the idea that, gravity, if I jump off, we've talked about this in class with our students, if I jump off that building, I can know with absolute certainty I'm going to get pretty injured. Those
you 99
laws.
and to be honest with you, for practical purposes, from a pragmatic purpose, yeah, absolutely. What I'm saying is that 99.9999, there's a tiny small percentage, right? Very ridiculously small chance. There's a massive gust of wind. Or a car would drive with 10 mattresses on top of it, right? Drives by just as you're falling, right? And it breaks your fall, right? And you don't get hurt. But you're saying gravity will still work. Well, gravity probably will work. Yeah, that's true. But do we know what really it is, gravity? Do we know what sort of... Could it be something else that's actually pulling you down, right? Most likely you're correct. And for all practical purposes, you're absolutely correct. But when we enter into the realm of epistemological certainty, I think you have to have some bit of humility that there's always a chance that you've not taken into account some variable, that your understanding is always incomplete, not wrong. That's the bit that I do want to emphasize. There's a massive difference between saying I'm wrong and saying that I'm probably right, but my understanding is incomplete.
How likely is it, you think, that someone who's grown up in a very narrow bubble is more likely to assume they're correct about those kind of thoughts, as opposed to someone like yourself who has probably found themselves thinking they were wrong many times?
If you only have one operating software, then you can't go into its own epistemological and ontological assumptions, right? Let me give you an example. If all you've done is law, then the legal subject, which is really an intellectual creation over hundreds of years, right? That legal subject is assumptions about what it means to be a person that the law has made in order to be able to use its theories on that subject, right? So we made the subject in order to fit our theories and our legal principles, right? The idea that if someone, the notion of responsibility bakes into it certain capacities of agency, right? Certain issues of necessity, that legal subject is a construct, and it is probably a very good construct. I'm not saying that, but that construct has limitations to it, right? That construct is not, it is a model for reality. It is not a model of reality, right? And when we forget that, which if this is the only perspective you have, you assume that is human nature. And this is not just tendency of law, it's in every culture. If all you have is your one history, then you'll absorb that history and think it human nature. If all you have is one history, you'll absorb it and think that human nature. Contrast that with a biological person, right, which has a very different conception of what it means to be a subject. And then when I did sociology, so that's the third aspect of it, right, where it said what it means to be a subject is so culturally constructed, right, that humanity is really a potentiality. And culture is, that it furnishes you with the raw resources to be able to make something, a symbolically aware creature that can create its own meanings and its own web of signification, and then suspend itself in those very webs of signification, and then forget that it was the one who spun that, right? To think that its world was created from the outside as opposed from the inside out.
Is that what drew you to sociology, that that implication, that fact right there, that insight, I guess. Is that one of the things that...
That was, and it actually has to do with a scholarship that I got where I got to go to Singapore on a scholarship around 2010 from memory. And we were studying religion and society, right? And I went to 2 different communities in Singapore, very similar dynamics, right? Between 2 religious groups. And one community was thriving and the other one was struggling. Right? It's a bit more complicated than that, but in essence, that's what was happening to my limited understanding. And one of the key variables that I started noticing is that the leadership group in the community that were thriving seemed to have been really good friends for a very long time. So much of the community interactions was premised and funneled through their personal, intimate relationship in which they were really close mates. And I started noticing the filtering effect of that. And then I noticed in the other community where they didn't have this, there was all sorts of issues, right? Issues would emerge, but they would not be resolved. Where here, issues would emerge and then a compromise would be reached that most parties were happy to. I went, wait a second, that's really fascinating. This is a microcosm in which people are making the culture that they're living in, and I'm noticing that leadership seems to have this amazing effect, right? It materially changes so many people's lives. I really need to study these dynamics because so far the law, the language of power, the law works in the area of what you must not do. Rarely there's a law, there's a few principles, few things you must do, but those are quite limited. It's often what you must not do. So it leaves a lot of room for culture to do its thing, right? Where basically you don't have state violence forcing you to do something or not doing something. And we are okay with that because we should be allowed freedom outside of the code of laws. Because in effect, if you really think about it, when it comes to committing crime, you really don't have a choice. Right? Not a proper choice in the sense that, you are the one who's going to have to bear the burden of it and go, I should punish myself. It's usually the state that punishes you. So therefore, a lot of people don't commit crime because of the violence that the state will do to you if you do if you do commit that violence. Not necessarily out of the pure philosophical notion that I shouldn't do this because this is wrong. Right?
I never really thought about law in that way, that it's
I've thought about
focus on what you ought not do, and leaves that enormous space
absolutely
empty for what you ought do, and that's where culture determines that.
And a lot of this should be processed in the cultural space. And I started noticing some of the variables that shapes this cultural process. Of course, history, leadership, and
what about the size of communities as well? I mean, that has to play a bigger role. Totally. I'm thinking small towns where everyone knows what everyone does. You're probably less likely to commit crimes because.
True, because of the proximity factor. And that's not necessarily an ethical thing. I'll explain what I mean. Committing a crime against someone you know and then seeing the pain on their face, that's terrible, right? But when we do something at a distance, right? When we shoot someone from a distance, surely ethically that should be just as bad as hurting somebody close to us. Ethically, should there be an ethical difference between hurting somebody at a distance that you don't know versus hurting somebody that you do know at a close proximity, right? Ethically, I'm not sure if there is a difference. You could argue that there is, and it's due to some other factors. But the point being here that if you confine your ethics to who you identify with in a face-to-face manner, it's ethical tribalism. Right, so and that is and I would argue that's the factory settings, so to speak, right, on our base of human beings. I would personally argue that's the base software. It's not the only software we're capable of, but it's the base software. If left to our own devices without a big state, I think we revert back to some sort of ethical tribalism. Not that we don't do ethical tribalism at the level of the nation. The shift that happens, I actually think happens imaginatively. Right, the level of coordination, of course, it's exponentially more complex from a small community, right, where you know everybody face to face, to a community where you cannot physically know everyone face to face. Suddenly, you have to have symbolic ways of sharing an identity that can't be interpersonally communicated. Right, it is suddenly you have to adopt an impersonal identity, like an Australian. Right, we share that symbolic category, right, and a whole bunch of rights and obligations that we've built in through our legal system comes with that shared obligation. But that obligation only exists in our imagination. So the moment you go to the moment you can no longer meet everybody face to face and negotiate with them face to face, you have to create institutions that regulate this imaginative space in which you imagine yourself to be in relations with others that you physically cannot be in. right?
You're talking social media type things now?
Social media is definitely part of that. Literature was definitely part of that. Language is definitely part of that. And language is the main way of structuring this symbolic community. So having a shared language is a big factor in that.
Well, so can we talk about social media briefly as well? Because that is this large false kind of community where everyone's kind of fake. And how does that work?
It's only fake in the sense that we can see the very act of making those communities, right? It's fake in the same way that I think any community is fake. That humans make it, and they do it sometimes really badly. And when you can see the stitching, right, it looks really shoddy. It's not that this is not any less real than the nation state.
But people are more inclined to do bad, to insult people.
Well, there's probably a tendency towards ethical tribalism.
There is.
On social media, isn't it?
There is. It's basically the difference between distinctions and boundaries, right? Part of the reason why this social media space is such a mess right now is because we're trying to draw distinctions that we're comfortable with, and then those distinctions being transformed into symbolic boundaries, right? And which then in turn becomes social boundaries. So we generated a distinction, then a symbolic boundary around us, and then a social boundary around us. Because it's almost like a new continent has emerged, right? And everybody's trying to claim their little piece with the group that they identify with. The only difference now compared to that physical continent is that there is no limit as to how quickly we can move on that geography. So in some ways, it seems like a really messy space, partly because it is, but there's nothing going on in social media that has not happened on the physical space, on the physical nation states. Given enough time and maybe enough boundaries drawing, right, suddenly those spaces will start to stabilize, and we will have the equivalent of nation states, or there'll be people who will pull up boundaries. So when they log in, they only log into that particular space in which they agree with those distinctions, they share the symbolic community, and there's a social boundary with digital passwords blocking them off from people who don't belong to that community. If I was going to say it this way, we haven't done enough exclusion on social media for it to be stabilized yet.
So how does that relate to empathy being related to proximity, whereas shooting someone from afar, we're essentially shooting a whole bunch of people from afar?
That's right. It's part of it is I think our brains were designed for other human faces, right? That's why I think we see human faces in all sorts of things, even when there isn't a human face, right? People see it in all sorts of weird things. This comes from the work of Levinas and a few others, and basically the idea that if you have to make a decision, and the person that this decision is going to affect is right in front of you, and you can see their face, right? And their face, and your face is going to be accountable to their face. For most human beings, 99% of us who don't have sociopathic traits, right? That hurts us. If we have to make a decision that hurts them, then we have to bear that. So that's why I think a tribal leader, in some ways, their politics were much harder, because if they had to make a tough decision, they had to say it to that person's face, see that person's face, and the decision had to be of such importance, or they had to be so persuasive that that human being accepted it. Nowadays, if you never have to confront the face of the person that you made this terrible decision about, right, you don't feel it.
I heard a horrible thing a little while ago that due to the amount of addiction, mobile phones, a lot of mothers are looking at their phone instead of staring into their baby's eyes while breastfeeding, and that's it's hindering the development of mirror neurons, which doesn't allow for development of empathy.
That's really interesting. There's two strands here. There's a moral panic about women being proper mothers, which actually has been a trend from I think from the start of human society. They've been like, oh, look at those women. They look at fruits and pretty flowers as opposed to looking at their children, right? Look how bad women they are, right? To the Industrial Revolution, then subsequent, look, they go to work and they don't look after their children, they're bad women, right? To when they started educating the idea that somehow the blood would flow away from their womb and into their brain, so they wouldn't be good mothers, right? I wonder how much of that trope is now feeding into this.
Yeah, possibly. Like how bad is television? And now it's just something
right.
else.
The interesting part about this is not whether this story is true or not, but the interesting part is how people are sharing it. Because I've heard that
Yeah,
story so many times.
Yeah, I don't
right?
know how true it is.
But notice that it feels true. That's when you've got something as a sociologist.
Yeah.
Not that it's something feels true. It taps into something deeper that's going under the surface.
Well, you could see if that was the case where you were spending no time, actually engaging with your child, that would be a problem. How much of that's happening, I couldn't say.
Part of it is we no longer do alloparenting. So alloparenting is the idea that really most children in our species get raised by the community around them. The idea of the parents looking after the children is very new. Our ancestors would find that idea so strange. What? I know you guys are raising children on your own as with your partners as a nuclear family.
Well, I think all the societies had to deal with that over the last month or so with coronavirus. And now everyone's panicking. Let's get
on
back
occasion, you'd prefer the village with a child.
And to be honest with you, I don't know if two people, and that's why I'm so, there's a part of me that really feels for you guys. I don't think we were designed psychologically. I don't think you have sufficient internal resources, right? Two of you to really raise children. I think you need a lot more people around you. And the idea that we just expect two people on top of work, right? It's no wonder so many of you guys are exhausted, sleep deprived, and you do it out of love, right? And I think that's how they get you. It's because you love someone more than yourself. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. This is not the right way of doing it. It's not the most optimal way of doing it, but it is the way that would generate the most amount of capital, because it would make sure that even though you have your children, your productive capacity in the economy is not diminished. So we're doing this really interesting thing where we're going, we're okay with your children being raised up a bit badly if it means you're going to be a good worker today. Right? And that's a choice we made. That's a choice in our political economy that we made.
Yeah, it's a funny choice, I think, sometimes. This perpetual growth that constantly needs to occur in all economies.
It's and again, that has to do with, if you go back to the ontological and epistemological assumptions of economics, the idea of human beings being a self-interested creature. Firstly, that's an assumption that's built into every model. Then the idea of them having endless needs and wants, right? Why is that a thing? Is that real? Do human beings really do that? I would argue that's an ontological assumption that's been built into people and culturally cultivated. These are cultivated traits, not stuff that you were born with. But you absorb your history and think in biology, right? We think human beings have endless needs and wants. Other cultures, not necessarily, right? Other cultures have notions of enoughness that we lack, right? They're okay with certain things at a certain point being, no, we don't want to do this anymore. The idea of producing capital in order to produce more capital is also a notion that has only been around for the last 500 years. Again, and we created the very human beings that we created the very humanity that we thought we were born with, right? Homo economicus was culturally created. He or she is not born, right? That potentiality is reduced to this one narrow ambit. And if you go back, this particular notion of human beings as this needless, this ever-wanting, ever-needing creature actually goes back to a very old idea that you can even find in Augustine, right? So again, if you have a cultural perspective and if you have a theological perspective on this, Augustine's idea was that man was this incomplete creature. Basically, he was born in a world of sin because of original sin, and man is a fallen creature. And he's born with a God-shaped hole. And he tries to fill that with things, but he never will, because the only thing that will fill that is God himself. And to the analogy that I use is, it's a bit like if we're born in a world where we're really thirsty, but the world is made out of salt water. Right? It's a trap. The moment you drink of this world, you will get thirsty and thirsty and thirsty. It's only when you go above to the water of God do you actually find that your thirst is quenched. Now, notice that there's a conception of human beings as this always wanting, always needing more things to fill the God-shaped hole. This was transformed by economics into the model of the human being that we should base our whole economy on. So what was for the theologians the source of our greatest shame became for the economists a rational mode upon which we could socially coordinate all modes of production.
And goes virtually unquestioned now.
Absolutely. And again, if you understand politics, you realize that so much labor goes into making certain cultural arrangements look natural. So the labor of naturalization. Notice this tool from political sciences, this analytical category, helps you understand economics better, right? Helps you understand aspects of our society better. Being able to take something from one context and use it for another context, there is something, and that's where I think the original insights come, right? Original insights about a discipline always come, I think, from outside that, something from outside that discipline.
Yeah, I want to ask you a few more questions relating, because I think just from this interview so far, we've seen your incredible grasp of so many disciplines, and you're dancing from one domain to the next very comfortably. But I want to get to when you come in and you teach our boys, our year 9s and 10s, you have them in a room and you're thinking about a problem or an issue that you want to bring to the table for the boys. How do you conceptualize how you're going to bring all of those pieces together? Or, you know, the way, I mean, at times I can see you just sort of doing it on the fly in a lesson, but when you're preparing to teach those boys and you're putting it all together, and I know that you use a lot of sort of philosophical tools to do that, can you kind of articulate how that looks when you're in a classroom with the kids, how you're thinking about that?
I suppose the first assumption that I walk into in any classroom, whenever you give me a topic, is that whatever the topic and whatever problem it gives rise to, that problem doesn't belong to a discipline, because every problem in the real world is inherently interdisciplinary, right? Problems are inherently interdisciplinary. And what we've done in order to make education a little bit easier both on the educators, right, and to make the process a bit quicker, even if it necessarily isn't the best way, is what we've done is we've taken understandings of problems and we've characterized them into different categories. And we've artificially drawn boundaries around it for the sake of convenience, for the sake of practicality. And we've said, you teach this particular part, but make sure you have this boundary. Don't cross it into this, because we think students will be overwhelmed by it. And then someone else takes another area, someone else takes another area, someone else takes another area. Now, it would be amazing if a problem fell squarely within one particular isolated domain that we, by the way, have drawn artificial boundaries around. But rarely have I seen a problem worth solving in this world.
Well, we generate those problems ourselves in that silo. We're like, well, okay, what will fit within this silo? Let's ask this question.
That's right. And that problem is usually, you already have the answers to.
How many people do you think believe that we should be teaching in silos?
I think it's really easy to teach in silos. And I use this analogy that this little tale, I suppose. You find a person who's on the street and they're under a street lamp and they're patting down the ground underneath the street lamp, and you ask them, what are you doing here? And he says to you, I lost my keys. I'm looking for my keys. Can you help me? So you get down on your knees and you're both patting the ground around this lamp, and you ask them, wait a second, where was the last place you saw your keys? And he turns around and he says, oh, down the street in my house. You're like, wait a second, why are we under the lamp here? And he says to you, oh, there's more light here. And that for me is kind of the story of why do we teach in silos. We teach it for the same reason that guy's looking under the lamp, because it's easier there, right? Looking for his keys in the house where the keys are actually at. That's hard. That's going to take time. That's going to take a lot of labor. And we much rather get the feeling that we're doing something, right, and give ourselves a pat on the back than really do the hard work.
So you think it's a personnel issue in terms of the teachers themselves?
Partly that, and partly that in order to do really good, deep interdisciplinary teaching would require a lot more time between students and teachers, sitting down there discussing. It takes a lot more labor, and it can't be standardized.
Yeah, less structured.
It can't be structured.
And
the same way.
I guess institutions and governments all need to recognise this and make changes.
Totally. And there's no time limit. When I did a course here with boys for over a few years, where we would start with a project, right? Some sort of issue that we saw in the world, and the boys would learn about this issue from all different perspectives, right? So one of my favorite ones was open defecation, right? So one of my boys had to learn about open defecation.
Sounds fun.
It was fascinating, right? The amount of human beings who have to drink feces-infested water. Had to learn about toilets, right? How does it actually work? The history of toilets, right? But then the cultural practices around toilets. Also, different cultures understand our biology differently. Some people think of poo's not that bad. Some people think of it's really, really bad, right? And then it's gendered. Some people think of it in gendered ways, right? And then there's the physics of it. right? Because fluid dynamics, right? He had to look at the fluid dynamics of how we would move, how much viscosity was needed in order to create really good tunnelage, right? For all of these questions, right? In order to solve this issue that we were working on. And that took a good year. And I couldn't do that in a month. This had to be a slow process as this young man was grappling with all these different areas and he was having to do integration. And the end point was not a grade. The end point was not me giving him some money. So I had no stick, I had no carrot. It had to be the problem itself. And part of the teacher's labor here was motivating this young man, keeping them, you're doing really, really well, because you want to quit because it's hard. You don't want to think about it so many levels. You just want to jump to some easy solution and just start with that. Yeah. But the motto that we had in that particular cohort was that part of the reason why these problems seem intractable is because we have misdiagnosed them. So that was our little mantra, right? We've misdiagnosed problems. So that's why I got my boys to go through this process in such a rigorous way. I would only be paid for a tiny amount of time, but I would have to do a lot of Skype sessions after school with the boys and their parents, right? And again, their parents were quite supportive of this. But that was a lot of labor on my part that I would never get paid for. And I did it because I really wanted to see what this would actually look like. And at the end of it, some of my boys intellectually grew so much, and I could see that in real time.
I heard a great quote. It was, a problem well defined is half solved.
I totally agree with that. Yeah. Totally agree with that.
So Akram, can I ask you then, if we think about how the importance of relevance and engagement for students, and we often hear kids saying, why am I learning this? It's not relevant. Do you think that is a result of the siloing of the knowledge that we're trying to give them? Like they've got a greater chance of thinking that is unengaging and irrelevant if they don't see the kind of see it from the context and the problem to begin with, and then feed in an interdisciplinary way to an answer to that problem.
I understand what you mean, and part of it actually goes back to my own personal story. Right? Do you remember how after Mr. Bell gave me that knowledge, right, and I was able to share it with others, suddenly I realized I could do something real with this in the world. It had a relevance, a social relevance, an ethical relevance, right? If I was sloppy with my knowledge, I couldn't give it properly to others. And if I didn't do a good job in terms of my own study, it would affect someone else, right? For the first time in my life, I realized what I did mattered in the world, and what I didn't do also mattered. If I did something shoddy, if I studied and didn't really care, I just gave that person, just X, Y, Z, and just kind of half-assed it, that person wouldn't do as well. They wouldn't intellectually grow. And
that's when you realize your knowledge is for others, not for yourself.
It has a relevance beyond me. Yes, I really find it passionate, and your passion can be selfish, but your purpose has to be selfless, right? And that's why I was so lucky that it was both my passion and my purpose, right? And I realized, yes, I enjoy this for myself, but it's also incredibly important that I know this in order to be able to help this person. And ever since then, it's been 16 years now, I've been so motivated for my teaching, way more than my own studies, because I realize if I don't read this and I don't understand this and I don't truly grasp it at the most foundational level, I can't explain this beautifully to my students. I can't engage them. I can't share with them my passion for this because I'll be stumbling over myself. Suddenly they're ethical stakes. That's why I really like the approach that we take, which is you give these boys simulations of real life challenges in which what they do and what they don't do, what they know and what they don't know, has an ethical implication for another human being, right? Suddenly it matters. Suddenly there's a social relevance to it. Often we play these games, right? Often we play these competitions. And at some level, the boys think this is about the competition. But slowly you realize, and as they get more mature, that if they don't do the right work, if they don't put in the hard work, they're going to let down their teammate. Suddenly you see them realizing that knowledge is not just something that I'm going to do for this particular test. And I hope everyone can see, and for folks listening at home, it is such a thin source of motivation to get a particular grade after putting 40 hours of work in and then get this tiny little grade.
It's right at the bottom, isn't it? It's the extrinsic level.
Totally. It's such a weak form of motivation, right? What we had with the boys in that MAD group is if they were able to generate a solution to the problem, or even if they were able to define the problem in a more clear way, or more robust way, a more honest way, they could actually share that with others. And the hope was, right, that they would have some influence on others. That would be a way of doing good in the world with their knowledge. the reason why I've had this question, and it's even worse, by the way, at tertiary level. At the tertiary level, Akram, what do I need to know in order to get a HD or get an 80? The number of times I get asked that question, the number of times I have to stifle my own response and just kind of clench and just smile because I know this person is trying to do their very best. Basically, it's a gamification of it, right? It's this. I don't really care about the knowledge. I don't really care about any of this. I just need to show my future employer that I've got this particular number. Whether I do or don't doesn't really matter. I just need to show the status to them. Give me that little badge so I can show them. And we don't really care about the substance that goes behind it. Give me the token, not the thing behind the token. The thing to the token.
Do you ever lecture them on what they're doing and try to explain to them?
You try, but see, the part of the reason why you kind of have to hold back is because they're in such an anxious space because they've put money for it. Because university, they're a bit like this. I've paid into the university, and as a customer, I demand a HD. Wait a second, you're a student, you have to go through this. No. I've paid into this. I want a return on my investment. And that's the logic that you're starting to see in the process. And to be honest with you, I have every incentive to not care about the standards and just give them the tokens that they want. You want a HD? Sure, go for it. Right? I'll lower my standards because right now this will help you, but in the long term it'll hurt you. But you don't care about the long term. You just want it in the short term because that's all you can see at the moment. And being able to forcing myself to go, no, I have to care more about them than their opinion of me. And so what I have to do is I have to hold to my standards, right? And I have to constrain myself from not indulging in what they want me to do, which is basically artificially carve out an area of law, put that tiny little space of law before them and say, hey, I'll just examine you on this. This is all you need to know, right? And this is a simple algorithm. Follow this and you'll get a HD.
Well, that's why I think we should be changing the way we assess to assess how they create their own tools.
Absolutely.
So with the analogy of someone making their own tools, that's what we need to assess. How can they make their tools to better gain knowledge rather than just rote learning type stuff?
Absolutely. And even sometimes with essays now, the problem is we think that this is critical thinking, but you can just now download another person's essay, put it through scrambling software, right? Changes up the words, changes up the order, so you can't really detect it anymore, right? And that becomes your essay. So yes, technology has done a lot of wonderful things for education, but there's a lot of problems that it's created too, right? And the bit that I keep going back to is, at some point, I'm going to have to present you with a problem that is sufficiently similar to the one that you're going to see in real life. And I want to see how well do you respond to that problem.
But there's something called useful ignorance. It's something you kind of touched on it before, where, and I'd like to ask you about it because you said that you kind of need to know everything about a subject before teaching it, whereas I don't have that opinion. I find the best teaching that I've had has been when I didn't actually know how to solve the problem and I was solving it in conjunction with students. And afterwards, I've gone through this process with designing all sorts of different products, and the best classes I have and the most engagement and the best results have been when we're all figuring out the problem together. And once I know all the problems that I'm going to face, it becomes boring and less engaging for the students.
That's brilliant. And I think your approach is right. My approach is one out of necessity of time.
And I think also
sorry, go on. I just wanted to add, I think when we teach those boys in philosophy and have Philosophy team, that's exactly what we're doing.
Right.
We're sort of constructing knowledge together in those groups, aren't we? And so the barrier between the teacher and the student is completely gone.
Totally.
And so
and
I
try to do that.
Comparison there with what you're doing.
I try to do that at tertiary level with extra classes with my students, but within the limitations of time, right, you kind of have to go with the old approach, right, where you have all the knowledge, here's all the knowledge, let's quickly apply it to a problem that we have artificially selected and artificially limited, right, and then just go through the process.
I think a lot of teachers take that approach just out of fear too.
There is the fear. If you have the time and you still use the old approach, then something's gone wrong, right? Part of the reason is we don't have the approach that we're talking about here, where you create a problem that's not limited to one particular discipline. You consciously make sure you've not created an artificial problem, an artificially limited problem. Then you put it to the students and you genuinely go through an intellectual journey with them. That's awesome. But that requires a lot of time. That requires a lot of labor. And to be honest with you, the sort of comfort and expertise that you have with being okay with not knowing, right? Knowing that you're going to figure this out, right? Not everybody has that training. Not every school has that time. And certainly not every school has that resources.
But the fascinating thing is everyone's in a rush. You know, you talk a lot about time in this interview. You know, people are sort of in a rush to get this particular knowledge that's not even going to be necessarily useful for them.
They want
but
the
they're
tokens
racing
of the
towards
knowledge.
it. They're having to speed up everything to get to that knowledge.
They want the sticker of the knowledge, not the knowledge itself. They want the token of the knowledge, not the knowledge itself.
And that knowledge will disappear as quickly as it came in.
Absolutely. Because it's so superficial. You're not going to get any problems that artificial in real life. So in the context of law, right, you get a problem that's just in one space, in one event, right? Rarely is something that simple in real life. Often it's an issue of torts, contracts, corporations, criminal, all bound up together. So you have to move between different areas of law. But we don't teach it that way because it's too hard, right? We try sometimes, believe me, we do try, but it requires time, effort, resources that we don't always have. And the problem is it looks good in the short term, but somebody's going to have to pay a price in the long term. And the long-term price often is the student. They realize they didn't get the skills that they needed in order to fully flourish. My idea of education is not one that you're job ready, although that's a nice benefit of it. Mine is, I think all education in any given culture is about, the purpose of it is about cultivating good judgment in those young people so they flourish in their future social obligations, right? I think every culture ever has, that is what they've tried to do with their education system, whether it's through the mentoring system that are so up north, traditional systems, or the more formalized system. And I think when you realize you have not cultivated enough internal resources within this person so they can make good judgments in the future and flourish in those social obligations, then what's the point of going through the charade of education, right? That's the bit that I wish we would just do away with, right? Either do it well or we don't do it, right? This way, at least we don't go through the charade and waste resources on the charade that somebody's got this token of knowledge.
And you need to give students the opportunity to make judgments in complex scenarios, don't you? And we don't do that.
That's exactly right. And that's part of the interdisciplinary approach, is that you have to make a judgment about which one of these contexts do you put more emphasis on, right? In the space in between these contexts, what is it that you draw from each and put in that intermediate space? You have to make a judgment on that. And to be honest, most of life is about making those judgments. And I think,
can I just say, I think, Steve, you've mentioned many times with your kids in STEM classes how some of the students there will just be utterly frozen when it's their time to make a judgment.
Yeah, I don't think it's just STEM. I think it's
no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's
they hit a barrier and don't even have any ways around it. Other than ask the teacher. What is it? Tell me, teacher. Well, I don't know. I'm sorry. You're going to have to figure that out yourself.
Yeah, and you're not. This is not even Socratic ignorance where you're pretending not to know.
I'm a really bad actor, so I actually have to not know. So that's why I pick things that I don't know how to do.
I think what you do really well in STEM too, though, is you force them on many occasions into those situations where they do have to make a judgment.
Yeah, I mean that's how I design the topics, really.
And the other thing that I really like about the way you approach your program is the end product always has some social relevance, doesn't it? Some ethical relevance, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, all engineering problems do.
That's right. You make a bad bridge, human beings are going to be hurt, right? You have an ethical obligation to produce good understanding of what a bridge is, right? In order to make sure human beings don't go through this. So part of the issue that I've been struggling with education is always trying to put back in the ethical implications of what they're learning, right? Because it concerns other people. And again, that's one of the assumptions that we make, that somehow the knowledge in your brain can be taught to you in an individualated manner. The idea that this knowledge can be in your brain and we don't have to think about its ramifications for third parties, for society at large, right? Ethically accounting for what you're learning should be baked into every one of these areas, which means that the ethical domain is always going to be there and you're always going to have to draw from the ethical domain and apply it. And that's always a matter of judgment. The ethical domain is a space of judgment. There is no inherent logic to it, right? There is no hard science to it. There is no quartz that you can go, there's the quartz, right? I see the structure of this. It's made by us, right? And we have to persuade one another about it, and it requires judgment. And the bit that I always get fascinated with is whenever you have postgraduate students, right, they go through this fascinating moment where before this, during their undergraduate degree, in law, I've seen this in social sciences, and I've seen this in the human biology space. They go, how on earth is it that human beings could have produced this much knowledge on this particular topic during their undergraduate? They read and read and read and read and read, and then suddenly they come to a terrible, shocking realization. They go, how on earth, in their postgraduate, right? How on earth could we know so little about this area? Right? And I now know this about law, right? You go corporations law, there's so much on it, but there's so many areas that we know so little about. How's that even possible? Which means the moment there's a problem that comes up that falls outside of what we know, right? Some human being has to come up with a judgment. All right? Someone has to make a judgment as to what we ought to do.
Research opportunity.
That's it, right? And if we can cultivate that in our boys, the comfort, not just the false confidence, right, to deal with problems that that do not yet have a solution and requires judgment from them, ethical judgment, technical judgment from them.
See that hole that you were talking about that can only be filled by God, we fill with wealth or whatever. It'd be good if that was the hole we filled, was more that quest for knowledge that we don't have.
Why not? I think we're malleable. Human beings are malleable enough for such a quest. And ultimately, I think the currency, this is the sociologist in me speaking, the ultimate currency is really recognition, right? After your $100 million, right, you're really seeking recognition, right? Because you don't really need any more material resources. If there was a way to create rituals, for example, that recognized learning and making good judgments, right? Celebrating, for example, when we talked earlier about emergency room doctors, why don't we celebrate them more, right? Should anyone be, money can't be the only way that we give recognition to people. That if money's the only tool you have to recognize people in your society, then something's gone terribly wrong.
Yeah, well, we celebrate fame more than anything, right?
We do, and we shower those people with money. I wonder if, and again, if we're the ones who want to make our culture, why can't we make it better? Why can't we change it? There's no one else that's going to step in and change our culture for us. We have to collectively make that choice. And
I think that was a really powerful point you made about the boys at Scotch make the culture. They decide if it's going to be a kinder environment. And obviously, and on a societal level, it's true too. But I thought that was really powerful.
One of the things that I've seen really change at Scotch and more generally in the system, education system, the way boys talk about, or rather the way they don't no longer talk about homosexuality. I've seen a sensitivity grow that was never there when I was their age, right? Just the way they talk about it, right? Compared to how it was talked about when I was their age, completely different, right? Not perfect. So there's a lot of room for us to ethically grow on that point, but just seeing how much that has changed really gives me hope on a lot of issues.
Yeah, I think we see it a lot in pop culture as well, the TV shows that we watch. And whereas I watched, it wasn't that old, it was like a John Travolta movie, Look Who's Talking or something, and man, that's you wouldn't get away with saying that kind of stuff these days.
Which is great. We've got 2 minutes to go, Akram. We could talk for hours, but I think we just want to. I was hoping we could finish with just a couple of quick fire questions.
Sure.
And so we asked these of the headmaster a couple of nights ago.
Right.
Favorite album was Bob Dylan's "Blood on the Tracks," by the way. So I hope you've got as good a taste as he has.
I don't. I really don't.
So, you're a pretty focused person.
Most of the time.
What distracts you most?
What distracts me most? There's so many things that do it. To be honest with you, the most distracting thing is running to a good friend. I'd happily speak to them for the rest of the day. Yeah, that's really, really bad. I could just lose myself in a conversation with another person, right? To the point where it actually hurts my future obligations with other things and other people and other commitments, because the rush of just being with somebody, the oxytocin rush, the endorphin rush.
Too enjoyable.
It's too enjoyable. It's a very selfish thing.
Favorite philosopher and why? I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like to hear you articulate that.
It shifts. Yeah, it really does shift. One person that keeps going back to me, and I always find him endlessly useful is Wittgenstein. I probably have memorized more than I understand of him, right? But he's one of those guys that has given you little gifts that have multiple layers, right? And there's a gift within a gift within a gift. And if you stay with him, right, you'll find more depth. He's constantly trying to help you think about the most difficult issues. And what I really like about him is his lack of pretension. And the fact that if you can't understand him, I think he's one of the few people, if you can't understand him, it's because you haven't done the hard thinking. It's not bad writing, it's bad thinking on my part, or not sufficient thinking on my part, right? And it's always humbling because he was somebody who saw the world in a depth that I could barely envision, right? The depth of his understanding of the world I could barely envision. So he's really helpful because he goes for the hardest stuff constantly.
Akram, thank you very much for joining us on the Range
Pleasure.
Project.
Pleasure.
It's been awesome and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.